Welcome to the DataStack Show. Kostas, the guests that we have never cease to amaze me. And we're talking with Max from Preset today. Not only has he worked at some of the biggest, most successful Silicon Valley companies, we're talking Ubisoft, Facebook, Airbnb, Lyft, but he also is the originator of several major open source products in the data space. So Airflow and Superset that are part of the Apache Foundation, pretty unbelievable. And what a privilege to talk to someone like Max. I'm super excited. One of the things that I really want to ask him about is, we'll see if I can sneak this in because maybe it's a little bit of a personal question, but, sort of having starting two projects like that, I wonder what it feels like to be the inventor of something like Airflow. That's just a really cool thing. And I think I tend to make that like a really grandiose thing in my mind, and maybe it was. But also I think a lot of times inventors are just trying to solve a problem that really interests them. So that's what I'm going to ask. How about you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it would also be awesome to ask him, what was the process? Like, how do you invent that stuff, right? Like, how do you end up building something that has this kind of adoption by like the industry or the community or whatever out there, right? So yeah, I'd love to hear that from him. I think it's going to be like super interesting. But I also want to ask him about BI. He's also a founder in a company that's like in the BI space right now. The BI space is something that, I don't know, lately we don't talk that much about it, but like it's one of the most fundamental parts of the data stack. So it would be awesome, like, to hear from him, like, what's the current state of the industry, what happened these past few years, and what's next.
All right, let's do it. Do you go by Max?
Max makes it easy on everyone. So
okay, cool. All right, recording.
Yeah, it's rolling. So take it away whenever.
Let's do it. Max, welcome to the DataStack Show. We can't wait to chat with you.
Hey, happy to be here. It's an honor to be on the show. I just realized just how many episodes there is on this show. I think I'm like number 70 something. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's fun. It's been super fun. Okay. I don't know where to begin because your resume is just incredible, but I would love to hear about how you got started in the world of tech, and then tell us how that transitioned specifically into working on data stuff.
So I started my career early 2000s. So right after the dot-com burst is when I started. I started early, so I did not finish my program in college. I didn't really go to college. I was lucky to strike an internship at a company called Ubisoft. That's well known now, at least, a big video game company. And I joined, did a little bit of web development early on during my internship, and then I had an opportunity to work on their first data team. And then of course, like, the data landscape was very different back then. But
what time frame was that?
So like 2001, 2001.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Data. So that's
very different data landscape.
Yeah. So the tech stack, well, so what's interesting, we can talk, one topic for today could be like, how we're kind of reinventing the same stuff over and over with different premises.
Sure.
But at the time we used the SQL Server. So Microsoft SQL Server stack. So there's SQL Server analysis services, SQL Server, the server itself. There was reporting services. I think that came a little bit after Office Web Components, and I think integration services, the other one. So that was the stack that we had selected at the time. And then I was lucky enough to be part of the team that created the first data warehouse, the first kind of business intelligence team there. So before my time there, it was very little databases, just Excel files, right? And and then I worked on, financial reporting, supply chain, like kind of your.
Oh, wow. So you're like deep
retail.
Into it.
So retail type stuff, and less like your game analytics or like your kind of modern analytics. So that was really like counting dollars and units sold at the time, looking at like inventory. So all that reporting. So very specialized team. So I worked there for quite a while, worked in three different offices. I worked in Montreal, Paris, and San Francisco. So I traveled the world over this first kind of decade of my career. And then like soon after I joined Yahoo, where was the birth of Hadoop at the time. It's kind of interesting times, right? So the Hadoop team would like meet in very office where I was at. So I had the opportunity to meet some of the early Hadoop folks. Wrote some of the early pig scripts. If people are familiar with the language, the pig language, it's a little bit of a funky SQL-like, not really SQL-like, the kind of data set language that's SQL-like in some ways. So working on some of that early stuff. And then I think the part that's really interesting for me is when I joined Facebook, it seemed like they were really kind of on the other side of what I would call like data modernity, like just we were in this completely different phase at Facebook at the time. So that was 2012, where everything was getting rebuilt from the ground up on top of Hadoop and other things, right? There was like this internal, like Cambrian explosion of data tools. So this hackathon culture of like build it if it doesn't exist. So they had rebuilt internally a lot of the things that existed in the market at the time, like from scratch, but also we're building things that have never been built before that, now, in some of the spaces that we're building stuff. I'll try to describe a little bit more like what I mean by that, but essentially like people internally at Facebook had rebuilt, a dashboarding tool, data exploration tool, an in-memory real-time database, something that was a big inspiration for Airflow that's called Data Swarm. That was an internal tool. There was like multiple experiments in the DAG kind of a data orchestration space too. And there was like all of these like kind of mutant little data tools too that, some like data quality stuff, some data dictionary stuff, data graph, metadata browser things. So early and not so early versions of some of these things that we see really kind of emerge today on the market. So it was a really inspiring time. For me, I was going from being kind of a BI engineer, data warehouse architect, to being like a software engineer and like building tools to enable more people to play with data. So very like data had been democratized at Facebook. People were like building all sorts of cool stuff, and it was super fun to be there at that time. Really inspiring too.
Absolutely. Okay, so what do you do today? I mean, you actually went to another couple like really amazing companies, but what do you do today?
Yeah, I mean, I can keep going. I think it makes sense to do the transition. So right after Facebook, I joined Airbnb, and that's where I was missing a lot of the data tools that we had internally at Facebook, and I kind of brought there, along with others, this mentality of like, let's build some stuff, let's solve these problems in a new way. And if I'm not going to have something like Data Swarm here, I'm going to build something that's going to solve my problems and my team's problem as a data engineer. And that's what became Airflow. So I was like, I want to get involved in open source. I was always like an admirer, of people who had built open source projects, and looking at the Linux kernel and other things, just being inspired by that. I was like, oh, maybe I can try to give that a shot. So I thought the timing was good to build something like Airflow, and then just decided to go with it. So I started building it actually between the two jobs. Before joining it, I was so excited. I'm like, I'm gonna make it open source. I'm gonna start working.
Oh wow! So okay, so it wasn't like the initial birth was between jobs.
It was in between jobs, but I knew I was joining, Airbnb. They needed, we had talked about, spent a lot of time with the data team there, talking to people, and it was clear that they needed something like that, and that I was going to be enabled to build it. So I was like, I'm just going to get started in that month in between. I think I missed a vesting cycle there, like a 3 months vesting cycle by a few days during that. So really not a great thing. 2014 Airbnb was a really good time, a pretty decent time to join. So, but as a result, though, I got to put the project like Airflow. I think it had a different name. Originally, it was called Flux. And I got to put it in open source under my GitHub. And as I joined, I'm like, well, this thing is already open source. Let's keep working on it. So I started working on a data mart. My primary function was like to do the data engineering for a core, what we called customer experience CX internally. And then I was building Airflow at the time, and then working with a small team of data engineers to building stuff, and we were kind of building Airflow at the same time as I was, we were solving these data engineering, challenges for them. And then, after I went like for a brief time at Lyft, so I spent a year there. I also, while I was at Airbnb, I started Apache Superset. It's also very well known. So Superset is very much in the data visualization, exploration, dashboarding space. And the general idea there is like we were investing heavily in Presto and Apache Druid, or I think it was pre-Apache, so Druid, the in-memory real-time database at the time, and none of the tools on the market, Looker and Tableau and the tools that existed at the time didn't work. Or didn't work well with the databases we were investing in.
Let me ask you a specific question there, because I think it's fun for our audience. They cross a wide spectrum, and I think some of them probably hear that and they say like, yes, I know, like I get that I had similar pain. But for a lot of people, it's like, man, Looker and Tableau are so powerful. Like, how could you ever, sort of reach the limit of those? Like, what did that look like and feel like inside the company in terms of hitting the limits of traditional BI? I know you mentioned that it was like sort of database integration stuff, but like, could you explain that dynamic a little bit?
Well, so one dynamic was, we had a large Presto cluster and had hired people from the Presto team, or, people who had used Presto in the past and were investing heavily in this thing. And that's our ad hoc layer. And then you tried to, I think we had Tableau at the time, and then we had to load stuff in extracts, which is like a subpar database, if you ask me, at least at the time, and there was this thing called the live mode, which would defer, kind of run the heavy lifting on the database itself, but that didn't work very well for a variety of reasons, I could expand into, but I won't. And then Druid at the time didn't speak SQL, it had this funky kind of dimensional query interface, and it just wouldn't talk to any BI tools at all. And there was no front end for it. So the very premise for Apache Superset was, I'm going to build a quick, that was a 3-day hackathon project to allow for exploration of Druid data sets. So Druid in-memory database, real-time, super fast, super fun database, heavily indexed, right? So just like blazing fast in real time. And we had some real-time use cases, internally at Airbnb.
Sure.
And Tableau, we just wouldn't, there's no socket to connect, nothing to anything. So I'm like, I'm going to build this thing. And then quickly, I could go deeper in that story, but Superset then, over a weekend or, at some point I was like, I got to make that work with Presto too. This is fun. This cool tool. You can explore the data, you can save charts, you can make dashboards. Let's make it work with Presto too. And and then that became much more ambitious over time because of internal adoption at Airbnb. People liked having a tool that was just like very fast time to chart, very fast time to dashboard, provided that the data sets have been created. So if the premise is you have a data set that has all the metrics and dimensions you need to create a dashboard, then exploring, visualizing, creating a dashboard, sharing it is really, really fast and efficient with Superset. So that was, instead of like, shooting at, Tableau is about getting to the perfect visualization and the grammar, the visual grammar,
Sure.
And be able to do very sophisticated things. So I call it the Photoshop of data visualization, right? You can do really powerful things. And then maybe Looker was all about, the semantic layer and be able to represent your business logic and this like semantic layer. So for us, it's just like visualize data sets quickly. So that took and that worked really well in the team at Airbnb and elsewhere and everywhere, really.
Amazing.
Yeah, that's quite a story. So Max, I mean, you've been around like for so long and you have seen like so many different things like happening. So before we get deeper into like what you're doing today and understand like what's preset and superset, is there like a technology that you have seen all these years that really surprised you, like in terms of like how it changed, let's say, the landscape? Or to put it like in a different way, from all that stuff that you have seen from Hadoop to whatever we have today, right? What do you think is like the most influential technology that has shaped today?
Yeah, and like so first it's like, yeah, the gray beard to show for all the years and data and all the lost there from scratching my head for decades, but I would say a lot of what we're doing now is like reinventing some of the things that existed a decade or two ago based on new premises. And then there's these cycles in software where there's some big shifts, right? The move to the cloud, and the move to like distributed systems first, and containerization, right? So once in a while, you take a set of new premises, and you have to rebuild everything on these premises. And then the pyramid of needs, like maybe is flipped a little sideways or upside down, right? I think one thing that's new from in the last like 5 to 10 years that did not really exist or exist well before is a streaming use cases. I think that it's been cool to see, different solution emerge around data streaming, kind of streaming queries, streaming, computation frameworks, things like Flink, or Spark streaming. And, there's been like, on top of that, there's new semantics and new things around streamings that are interesting. And there's people trying to bridge the two worlds and having these common languages to express both like batch and streaming using same frameworks. I would say that's been interesting to see, like brand new technology emerge there. There's a question like, what does that mean in terms of visualization for me and use cases? And, tons of thoughts there too. I think it also does relate to the chasm in analytics between operational data and business data, where operational data is much more kind of timely in a lot of ways. So there's like some things there that are really interesting to see too. Like we've gotten really good at operational streaming analytics too. You look at things like Datadog and Elastic, and there's some cool stuff there too.
Okay, that's actually pretty interesting, because you mentioned streaming and I never thought about the intersection of streaming and visualization. So I have to ask more now. I've seen like all these, like very interesting like platforms. Like we have Kafka, we have Flink, we have like Spark streaming. But how do they fit with BI and visualization? Like, is it needed, first of all? I mean, I start thinking right now, like about what was the call of this, like the Lambda architecture that was like a thing like a couple of years ago, right? Where you had the streaming layer that was more about notifications and like, something just broke and you have to go and fix it, that kind of stuff. And then you had batch, obviously, where you have reporting, and reporting is usually like the most common use case for visualization. But how do you see these two things like merging, and how do you see like visualization playing a role like with streaming?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like one immediate thought is like, when you really think about the data that needs to be really fresh. Well, so first I would say like there's like latency and freshness, and I think like fresh, like talking about latency of like, if we describe it as like how long it takes from the moment you run a query or ask a question, you get the answer. I think that's infinitely important, right? Like to be able to kind of dance with the data and like slice and dice, and like to be able to ask the next question as you go. I think that's transformative. An example that I keep giving there is like, if Google takes like milliseconds to give you a result, like if it took like 5 seconds, like think about the implication. If Google took like 5 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, 10 minutes, if it would take 10 minutes to resolve a Google search, it would still be a wonder of the universe in terms of like what it would allow for people to do, but how you interact with it, how you engage with it without autocomplete is completely different. So there, what I'm trying to point to is like latency is super important. Like now talking about freshness, it's like, if you really need to know what happened someplace in the past 30 seconds, and you're like looking at a chart and refreshing it, waiting for something to appear, like you should be a bot. Like you're not doing the right thing with your time. Like no one should be looking at a dashboard nonstop, waiting for an event to happen. Be like, now I'm going to refund this person. Click, done, approve. Yes, I've done my job. So I think like operational stuff then in some cases is really great for automation and bots and things like taking action. It's also good for troubleshooting, right? So there's an alert or something that happens in Datadog, your number of 500 errors, like, peaks. And then you're like, what the heck is going on? You need to know live and now, like what's happening in the past 5 minutes. So I think that stuff is like super operational and very different from like, is my business doing well? Like, if you're thinking about like, is my product doing well? There's some other use cases I think interesting around streaming. It's like when you launch something, you want to make sure it's good, right? Like you launch a new product change or you release something, you might want to get a little closer to real time to make sure your launch is doing well. But other than that, like for me, the bulk of the time, I'm thinking like 90 days analytics. A lot of the high value questions are, not things that happen in the past 5 minutes.
Yeah. I like when you were saying about, sitting on top of a dashboard and reloading all the time, trying to see that something is happening. Like I cannot like help myself but think of like the first time founder that just created, like a dashboard for signups or something like that, and being like, okay, where are the signups? Where are the signups? And dude, like you just need to go out there and create them and not look at the dashboard. That's what's going on with the signups. So yeah, many times we get like really, into this like, let's make everything like more real time and like faster and more fresh or whatever. But real time is a very relative term, right? Like not all use cases have the same definition of real time out there. So it makes a lot of sense. So, okay, let's... I
had like one or two more thoughts to unpack on real time. So one thing I think that one way I've been thinking about it too, because I've had a lot of conversations with, I call them streamers, the people like, like kind of streaming first, and people are arguing like, oh, we should just like get rid of those mountains of SQL and all the batch stuff and just rewrite everything in real time. That's going to be easy, right? Let's just do it. And I'm like, yeah, wait a minute. But like, when you think about like, what about freshness, like what do you need like visibility into for things that happen in the past, like, minute or two or 5 minutes or 10 minutes? What are really the metrics and dimensions and the level of accuracy that you need for these things? So when you really start looking into the use cases, and we've done that internally at Lyft and Airbnb, even like Lyft was much more like real-time business. When you ask people about why do you need freshness? Why do you need to know about what happened in the past minute? Then you realize the requirements are not as complex. Like maybe you just need a handful of dimensions and metrics, and maybe you don't need to know how many exact bookings, and just clicks on the booking button is enough, right? Like, so knowing this, I tend to say like, you don't even need, in a lot of cases, the Lambda architecture. You just need like, you have real-time requirements, you solve those with specialized tools, then you have like your business analytics, and you solve that with the right set of tools. And then, if they diverge and the numbers are not exactly the same, you explain the difference, because we use different tools, different definitions for things. And you move on with your life instead of trying to bring two worlds together that are very like far apart in reality.
Yeah, makes. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the other thing is, I think people lump a lot of stuff into the real-time versus batch debate. And there's, I think, a pretty clear separation between the analytics component and then the sort of customer experience side of things, right? So like, there are certain things that need to be delivered in an application in real time because a user is performing some action and there needs to be some sort of response, right? I mean, it's not trivial to build that stuff. But even then, not everything needs to be real time, which is interesting. And I'm just thinking about some of the companies that, like e-commerce companies who are running thousands of tests, for them, real time is like 15 minutes, right? I mean, a testing team can't really process results. Even at 15 minutes, it's pretty unbelievable. So definitely real time is like, it's such a relative term.
Right. And you have to really identify where there's value in it, and then what you're going to do to kind of support the use cases and what it's worth to you. Maybe the tooling will converge, right? Like we've seen some of that convergence a little bit, where the chasm between like business analytics and operational analytics is not as wide as it used to be, with the rise of tools that are like these next generation databases. They can serve, you know, on both sides of the fence. And you see things like, you know, Superset is becoming, you know, more and more used for operational analytics, and things like, you know, Grafana are more used for business. So I think this chasm is getting thinner over time. That's a good thing. And we used to have like these databases very specialized, at the real time, or the time series database for real-time use cases were very different and really support like OLAP use cases. And now that's kind of converging with things like, you know, Druid ClickHouse, Pinot, right? Like these new next generation databases.
Yep. It's very interesting, actually, like what you said about how things overlap, like with Grafana, for example, and Superset. So I have a question. Let's go. Let's talk a little bit about like BI, okay, and visualization, and let's give some definitions, right? So, what's BI?
What's BI? Business intelligence, right? Sounds so, I guess intelligence as it's an aging term. You know, I think it was around when I started my career. So when, you know, no gray hair, more hair up here, you know, that term was already well established. So that's like 20 something years ago. I think like the word intelligence come from, you know, the term that the way that the government thinks about intelligence, right? It's like like, you know, data, you know, insight, that kind of stuff. And then as applied to business. So I guess it means it's the set of like tools and best practices around, you know, analyzing and organizing and serving data. A huge trend, I would say, like the first, maybe I'm not sure exactly, like depending on where you look in the world, like when that trend was most active, but data democratization is a trend that's like maybe caught like on top of business intelligence. So the general idea of like, let's give access to more people, to more data. It's usually like business intelligence coupled with this idea of like data warehousing, which is like this practice of like hoarding data, right? Of like, I'm going to take all the data that has anything to do with my business that lives everywhere in the world, and then kind of hoard it and bring it into this warehouse that becomes a little bit the library for the data in the organization. And typically you have a BI tool, business intelligence tool, that sits on top of the data warehouse. And then people can self-serve in this, I would call it like general purpose, but specialist tool, right? So it's a tool that, you know, is made to, it's generic in the sense you can use a BI tool to query any type of data, you know, healthcare, business, products, whatever it might be. And it's like generally geared towards like, you know, specialists, like people who are trained. And we used to have like much more kind of specialists, you know, people that are, you know, business intelligence professionals, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's changing, right? Like we're seeing like the rise of data literacy now, like more people are more sophisticated with data and use data every day. So that means like these tools are kind of changing. And we, you know, maybe like talk about some of the trends, you know, like I think like BI was originally a little bit like a restaurant, you know, where to do like an imperfect analogy, where you'd come and you'd get a menu, you could kind of order your report, your chart, get it served to you, and then over time maybe change to become a little bit more like a buffet, right? Like people can come in and self-serve and then, you know, have access to a wider variety of things and kind of assemble a meal for themselves. But that's the general idea, maybe like trying to describe BI. I don't think I'm doing a great job at it. But yeah, too much context to unpack here.
So it's more than visualization, right? It's not just visualization, but visualization is an important part.
Yeah, and I call it like the database user interface, right? Like, you know, so it's like between like somewhere you have all of your data and people, and somewhere you have people with you know, their visual cortex and their brain, and somehow, you know, you need to get that data into people's head so that it becomes intelligence. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think like, you know, if you describe what these tools do is they expose your data sets in a way that hopefully people can self-serve to explore, visualize their data There's usually a dashboarding component we're able to put together an interactive set of visualization with some guardrails so people can understand their data and interact with it in safe or in somewhat intuitive ways. One thing that's, when I was saying, one thing that's interesting about BI, it's like any kind of data for any type of persona, with any kind of background. So it becomes like this tool that's, not very specialized. We don't have really clear personas or like a lot to stand on. It's very general purpose in that sense.
Yeah.
Right? Max, I have a question. How many companies, so like the goal of having self-serve BI is so appealing. And I think it's something that many companies are working towards. I know you can't actually estimate this, but like what percentage of companies do you think actually achieve that? I mean, you've built sort of these platforms inside of really large companies, but it's, even though like we have all the tools to do this, it's still pretty hard to actually achieve that inside of a company where you have these, like a wide variety of stakeholders who can access data sets that contain the information that is key to the business, combines data from other functions. Like, it still seems like a pretty big challenge for most companies.
It's huge, right? When you think about, this, we call it like the data maturity curve, and how, different companies or individuals kind of distribute on that curve. I think, and then, I have this view of the world where I work in Silicon Valley at very like data forward companies. So the answer is like, I probably don't know. But one thing I want to point out is that, the analytics process is extremely involved, and maybe trying to describe what I mean by the analytics process. But if the analytics process is the process by which you instrument, store, organize, transform your data so that it can be, explored, visualized, and consumed and acted upon. Like for, if BI is that last layer of like consume, visualize, and acted upon, like so much stuff needs to happen first for that to be even possible. Now we're talking about, data engineering and having a data analyst, data engineers, having, systems in place that actually store the data, make it available. There's just like so much that needs to happen for that to be possible, that I would say, the world is, I think, like if we were to visualize companies on this like data maturity life cycle, like we would have like a huge amount of companies that are very young at that to use like not a generous, but like a respectful term. Like they're just, companies will just like suck at that, really bad. I think in general, I think like in the past decade and in the next, there's a migration of like, everyone's going to become much better with data. It's just a matter of like survival at this point. And, one thing is like people have been thinking like, oh, but data should be easy. Like one day someone's going to fix it all and figure it all out. And, we're going to solve data engineering. We're going to solve BI and we'll be all done. And what we're realizing now is like the problems at least as complex and intricate and requires specialists, the same way that, software engineering has, we've accepted that software engineering is complicated. It's expensive. There's a bunch of specialists, like there's a bunch of sub-disciplines. I think we're realizing that data is just as important. We're very far from like, hey, you can have a team of like 5 to 10 people that are going to do data for your large, plus employee company. Like that's just, that's not going to cut it.
Yeah. Max, can you give us like a description of how the BI market looks today and where Preset fits in that?
Yeah, I mean, the market is a gigantic market that's like extremely validated, still has a foot. I would say there's like very big incumbents. And there, like I'm thinking like first wave BI. And when I say that, I'm thinking like business objects, MicroStrategy, Cognos, things that are like very much like dinosaurs. You don't hear about them as much unless you work, I don't know, at a company maybe that made decision about their technology and their data stack, a while ago. I think like there's, one thing that I think is a transformation that has not yet happened that we're going to see happen that, we're really interested in at Preset is, I was talking about data democratization before, where it's like bringing more people to the special place where you do data, right? So data democratization was like give more access to more data to more people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like the question ahead of us is how do we bring, instead of like how do we bring people to the data buffet, is more how do we bring food everywhere in the world? Like how do we do kind of Uber Eats, or how do we bring the right meal to everyone where they sit at on top of the buffet? The buffet is great. I think the buffet is okay. It totally works for a bunch of use cases. But I think what we're going to see is, analytics transcend the BI tool and the special purpose, the special tools like the BI tools, and come out and be part of everyday experiences, right? So that means like in every app that you use on your phone and every SaaS tool that you buy, there's going to be, interactive analytics in context where it's most useful. Two, on top, there's still the buffet. There's also like people walking with hors d'oeuvre everywhere. Would you like a little bit of a side of analytics with whatever you're doing right now? And I think like we're thinking very actively about this at Preset. It's to like beyond, there's embedded analytics I could get into, which is like how you bring a dashboard or charts in other contexts. But the problem we're after is how do we enable the generation of application builder to easily bring interactive analytics in the things they're building today? And I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's still very, very hard if you're building a product today, you're building experiences, to bring interactive analytics as part of these experiences. So we want to make it a lot easier for people to do that.
Okay, so let's say I'm building a product and I also need to expose some analytics, right, to my customers. How can I use Preset to do that?
Yeah, so that's a complex and intricate question that has multiple components. I think like what's clear is that there should be multiple ways to do this, and there's a bunch of trade-offs as to how you want to do this. The most obvious one is what I was just referring to as embedded analytics. So that's, you build a dashboard in a no-code tool, right? By the way, BI is the original like no-code tool. When you think about it, you're able to do these very, very complex things by drag and dropping, things on the screen. So, but you go and you build a dashboard, you style it, you parameterize it, and you embed this dashboard inside your application, right? Maybe you have an analytics portion of your SaaS product that shows a dashboard, and with embedded analytics with Preset, you're able to apply some role level security to say like, oh, I know it's this customer, therefore the dashboard will apply these filters so that they can see exactly the things that pertains to themselves, and there's isolation. Right? So there's embedded analytics. There's another idea that we cater to at Preset. That's I call it white label BI. So it's the idea there. It's also not necessarily a new idea, but it's being able to have these prepackaged BI environments that are essentially, they're a superset instance that's preloaded with the data sets, dashboards, charts, queries that are relevant to that one customer. So you can say for each one of my customer, I'm going to create a superset sandbox with all the data assets that they need. And then they can come and self-serve, and if you authorize them, they can write SQL and against the data that you expose to them. So that's the white label use case. And then another use case is more the component library. So there we're a little bit in the infancy of this, but I think we're excited to expose the building blocks of Preset and Superset as component libraries for people to remix into the experiences they want to create. So there you can picture you have a React library, we bring in some charts, we bring in some controls, maybe a selection picker, a filtering control, a date range picker. And as the application developer or as the engineer building the product, you create the exact experience that you want with these, these rich components that enable you to have these like cross filtering and drill down, these rich experiences that would be really prohibitive to build from scratch. That are really easy to build if you have the right framework.
Yeah, makes sense. And is this like, as a problem, is this related only to BI on the BI side, like something like preset, or we still need to do work with our data warehouses or the storage layer or the query layer out there to enable these use cases? Or I can just have Snowflake, just push all the data into Snowflake and then rely on preset to do that. Like, what's your experience?
Yeah, so like clearly this part of like, earlier I talked about the analytics process, and still, there's no BI happening, there's no visualization happening unless you've gotten all these things right. Yeah. I think in this specific case where we're talking about, embedded analytics or white labeling or a component library, in any case, I think the premise is that you created the data sets that you need with, the dimensions and the metrics that you want to expose in order to build a dashboard. So this, that's something that's like might be going back to like how BI is evolving. I think that BI is very monolithic in the sense that you would have the tool that includes the data munging, the data transformation, the semantic layer, which this is a super loaded term. We can decide whether we want to unpack semantic layer or not, but you have all of these things that were part of a platform like the Microsoft or Cognos or Business Objects. They would tend to be very monolithic. And I think what we're seeing now is like so say for me, the semantic layer belongs in the transform layer, and that's, DBT and Airflow space. And then we don't necessarily, so superset and preset, don't really actively solve that problem. We just say other people solve it much better than we could, and we just want to team up and integrate very well with them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I'm answering the question too. I know I'm deriving quite a bit too, but we're exploring a pretty complex space too here.
Yeah, no, you do. I mean, okay, I made also my question a little bit more specific to the storage layer, but as you said, like, it's not just one thing that has to be, like in its place in order for this like to work. Like, there are so many different things that need to happen, and you used to have the monolith of Cognos, but we don't. I mean, we still have monoliths, but things are starting like to break into smaller monoliths at least. And I think probably we see that like with BI, right? Like, I think it's one of the things that we see happening out there, and probably was one of the first markets to see that. But I think we also see that with even data warehousing, right? Like the whole idea of like having the data lake where you have the storage on S3, and then you have a different query engine on top of that, and then you have now you have a table engine, and all. I mean, so everything breaks into the smaller pieces. Right?
Yeah, warehouse, lakehouse, like special purpose databases, right? Like, do you use the same database for real time or not? It's going to be like, BigQuery with the BI engine and their like real time option that becomes a monolith that serves it all, or for real time you're going to use ClickHouse, Pinot, Druid, some of the databases are very specialized and use something else for your warehouse. So there's definitely, I think in the database space is really, with all of the money we've seen kind of flowing in the Snowflake place, like now people are looking to say like, oh, can we, maybe there's like some layers that we can kind of delaminate out of that and, build some big businesses and some tools in some of these areas. I think like that, to me, I see like exploration visualization as like it needs to explode, right? And at the database, I'm not as I'm not as sure about it. I think like, as a customer of a cloud data warehouse, I would like for the same database to do it all, to be like, hey, BigQuery, or hey, Snowflake, this is a table that's like is high availability, and pin it to memory because I need it to be fast. But I want to stay in the same warehouse. I don't want to go and purchase a bunch of tools. Right? Like people who are not in BI feel the same way about BI. It's like I want to buy one thing that does it all, but then you realize like that thing that does it all doesn't do anything right.
Yeah.
Talking about like a little bit like in the question, what is the analytics process to power something like embedded or what I refer to as white label BI. And for embedded, it's pretty simple. As long as you have, we can apply the BI tool or preset superset can apply row level security on the fly. So all is required is to say like, this user is this customer ID, just apply a customer ID filter on all the queries that you run. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's like row level security. I think for white labeled, it's a little bit more intricate where you might want to create like a data mart for each customer. And really what I mean by that, it can just be like a view layer, right? On top of, so say you have like 5 tables you want to expose to each one of your customers. What you can do is create these schemas that have views that filter on a specific customer ID, and then you give them access with a service account to that specific schema that is limited to their data. But hopefully your schema, you have a universal schema that's the same for all your customers, is all refresh perhaps atomically, right? Like you refresh the whole thing every night or every hour. But you have these little islands or windows into the warehouse that are filtered on and isolated just for them. And then, then you put a BI tool on top of that schema and you provide CAN reporting, CAN dashboard, and then they can knock themselves out and go and push that further.
Yeah, that's super interesting. One last question from me, and then I'll give the microphone to Eric to ask his questions. So can you share like some things, some opportunities that you think there exist right now in the BI market, like things that you would like to see happening or you expect to see happening, or like something to help our listeners, like also, I don't know, maybe go and build like a product out there, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the idea of like bringing analytics everywhere. And the premise is like, people are more data literate than they used to be, right? Not only people expect to find a dashboard in every SaaS application, but they expect that, and that becomes a requirement. I think also like people, in everything that they do, if you post, a blog post on Medium, or even like me participating in this podcast, I would expect to see a dashboard on how this podcast is doing, in real time as we release it, and be able to see like, well, who's listening to the podcast, and what are the demographics. I think like we're starting to really expect more and more analytics everywhere, and people are trained, and they want interactive analytics, not just like static too. Yep. And it's going to be real hard to go and build that, with the building blocks that exist today. The building blocks being like charting libraries and, data warehouse drivers, Yeah. So, I think there's a real opportunity of thinking about like, how do we enable people to bring analytics in all the experiences, every day. They build. So I think that's interesting. So how is BI going to come out of its shell, or is analytics going to come out of its shell and then, outshine and kind of like ray out and be everywhere. So like we're really interested in accelerating this, a preset. And then I think like other trends, maybe beyond business intelligence, it's like big topic for me has been thinking about how we take the learnings from some of the DevOps practices and the DevOps movement and apply, transform that and reapply that and reinvent that for the data people. Or, and then, the big thing that's really interesting too is how is the modern data team evolving? Like, what do they do? Like, what are the roles, and like, how do we enable others to become better with data? So you become this vector to enable everyone to kind of self-serve.
Super cool.
Fascinating. Well, 2 more questions from me, and one of them may take us down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but hopefully Brooks doesn't get too upset with us for going a little bit over. Just thinking about what you were saying on this sort of the frontiers in BI. What do you think is going to be commoditized first, or what do you see being commoditized? And the context behind that question is, you make such a good point in that the amount of work that needs to be done in order, like on the back end, in order to enable self-serve BI is immense. But also there are patterns around that. So if you think about visualization, like a lot of businesses can sort of can conform to like a particular, say, data model for the business, right? Whatever, like a direct to consumer mobile app, or, and everyone has their different KPIs. But do you think that there will be a lot of commoditization in the actual visualizations as the data layer becomes more established and defined, sort of across business models?
I think so. I mean, like for me, I think like we're trying to accelerate that in some way so we can really innovate too, right? So like as you commoditize things, there's opportunity to go and innovate further. Open source is a tidal wave of commoditization. It's free. It's like, remixable, so I think like clearly we're doing that in the BI space with Apache Superset first. And we also have freemium, so preset as a freemium offering on Apache Superset. So today you can go and sign up for, a free open source project and have it, run for you up to 5 people for free. And I think the price point too is very competitive. So I think we're trying to accelerate data out of market. Our mission is to make every team a data team. Enable everyone to have the best tool to visualize, collaborate, with data. So I think like that's clearly happening, but beyond that, I think there's as we commoditize the consumption visualization layer, there's opportunities to go and innovate. For us, a theme is like enabling people to bring analytics everywhere. That's one theme. One thing I've discovered too is like in the data world, as you walk to the horizon, then the horizon gets further, right? So
it's like the universe, right? Ever expanding.
That's it. And you're like, oh, I climbed on the top of that tree and I saw how far the horizon is, and by the time I get there, I will be at the edge of the world. And then you walk there, the horizon kind of moves with you, and you climb in a tree and you see you're not there quite yet. So I think like that on this front, for one thing I would really like to see is to see like all the data in the world or in your company being like instantly queryable, right? Like, that would be great if everything was in memory and you could ask any question and get all the answers. But the moment we create an amazing the next generation in memory databases, then people are like, well, I'm going to log more data, I have like sensors, that is like, then you start hoarding more stuff. So the bigger the house is, the more you hoard stuff, and you never kind of get to fully solve any of the problem. And maybe that's the beauty of it. Like totally. How are we gonna solve software engineering? It won't be solved. It will just continue to morph and grow and evolve.
No, I think that's a great perspective. Okay, last question, because we really are close to time here, but I'm interested to know, so you've been really you've started some projects that have become data tooling that are, at least in whatever subset of the world, that a lot of data engineers operate in, sort of just go-to tooling, which is pretty amazing. And I'm interested to know, what did it feel like when you were creating those? Did it feel like you were just sort of solving a problem that was right in front of you? Or, it's kind of, I guess I'm asking you this almost as like an inventor, right? Like, did you feel like you were inventing something, or was it just a problem in front of you that happened to like, solve like a pretty critical, like pervasive, pain point?
I don't know. I think the history of innovation is made of people kind of remixing things. So if you look at any of the great inventions in the history of humanity, not any, like there are some really important exception to the rule, but you look at like what Isaac Newton had, like at the time, like what was he reading? And so I think Newton is actually a bad example, because he actually pushed the edge of innovation quite a bit.
Like inventing calculus and all that crazy stuff.
Yeah, so I think that's a bad example. I think Tesla is also, like Nikola Tesla is also a bad example of that. But everywhere else, and a lot of places that you look at any of the, like, who were their contemporaries and what were they reading at the time? What were they thinking about? Who were they talking to, exchanging correspondence with through letter at the time?
Sure.
Like the collective imagination was already on the cusp often of what they discovered. So I think it's very much the case, like Airflow was largely inspired by 2 or 3 products internally at Facebook, DataSwarm, DataB, some other things. Those were the things that emerged internally at Facebook from a bunch of experiments, right? So maybe it was a fast innovation. Those were the things that people internally decided to put their pipelines and DAGs into. And then I took some of that stuff, remixed that with some of the things that I learned, in Informatica and like using other tools, and kind of remixed that into something that I thought was going to be really immediately useful for, at Airbnb for my team, and knew that, people, coming out of Facebook, which we're going to look for things like that. So there's like this idea, like, people talk about product market fit, in business, but there's like project community fit too, and open source. So there's like a timing thing too of like what, right? So if you were to build Airflow 5 years before, then probably people, it's too early. It's not the right thing. People are not really, doesn't fit people's mental model. It doesn't resonate just yet. So there's always this kind of timing aspect where you got to be early, but not too early. So I think there's like always like, some luck, some context, some hard work too. And then, community building too, which is a whole different topic, but like how do you get people kind of interested and involved and excited about stuff and get people to contribute. So I think that's something that I figured out how to do in an okay way for both Airflow and Superset.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's just so fun to be able to talk to people who have, sort of conceived of and built the tools that we use. But as you point out, we sort of stand on the shoulders of lots of people who have done lots of cool things. So Max, this has been an incredible conversation. The episode flew by, but thank you for joining us. We'd love to have you back on to dig into all, we could go for hours here, but thank you so much for giving us some of your time.
Yeah, it was super fun. I think we did, scratch the surface. We got a little deeper in some areas. But I think that's good and fun, but there's still so much more to talk about. So happy to come back on the show anytime.
Great. One thing that really struck me was, this may sound like a funny conclusion, but Max has a very open mind about a lot of things, even BI, and he's building a company in the BI space. I mean, he certainly has strong opinions, but I really loved his analogy of, you sort of think you get to the horizon and you climb a tree to look over the horizon, you realize like the horizon just keeps moving. And I think that's really clear in the way that he approaches problems. He's trying to look for that frontier, and he keeps a very open mind. And I just appreciated that a ton. How about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way you put it, like, makes me think that probably that's a trait that an inventor needs to have in order to be an inventor, right? So being like in an environment that changes so rapidly, like what he described, like think about early days in Facebook, right? How the engineering was in there, and like all the things that one project after the other, and like building new technologies and building everything from scratch, even if it already existed. So yeah, I think it makes total sense, and it's an amazing trade for both an inventor and I would say also for a founder. So I'm really looking forward to see like what's next about with presets.
Me too. All right. Well, thanks for joining us on the DataStack Show, and we will catch you on the next one.
Yeah.